but it's called Attention, Entropy, and the Hour of Time, and it's really about John Latham's idea of the attention unit, and also this question of time, and why he really doesn't seem to talk much about entropy, even though I think entropy is really key to his work, and it's the way time is defined by a lot of physicists. So this is the little symbol, the little triangle symbol, is the attention unit, the delta sign. It's the alternative system of measurement outlined in principle. Fundamentally, this refers to the unit of attention, the level of attention induced or found within a group, society, or population. Wealth in delta terms is measured in, can't read it, measured in principle only, but becomes evident in pounds, in money in retrospect. So this is another one of his, Latham had a whole, within his whole kind of complex system, he had these various different concepts and so on that all kind of come in. So there's a diagram on the right hand side. This is a diagram from it's from one of the work artist placement group proposals. So you see the timeline at the bottom, going from 1/10 of a second to n million years. This is kind of, I guess, a combination of a sort of organisation chart with a timeline, and you see the area of attention down the bottom. I'm not quite sure, like a lot of Latham stuff, not quite sure exactly how this operates. They seem to spread out over millions of years, and then they kind of hit this next level, which is the formation of the idea, before kind of getting to somewhere more practical in terms of kind of money, and this is where the kind of government funding and so on would come in. But what's kind of really interesting about this now, I think, is the fact that we now talk a lot about the attention economy. And just briefly, the attention economy is this idea that we are products whose attention is being exploited or captured in some way and then sold on. So it's this kind of question of time in terms of a kind of time of attending to something. And if someone can grab that, that can obviously, someone can make money out of that. And this is very much about how the internet functions with social media. And so in this later definition, he actually talks about a universal metric for the internet. When we have established the framework, i.e. website hit counters are actually attention unit meters. So this is very interesting. I mean, I would say this is, very much established now in terms of how these things are measured in terms of hits, and certainly in terms of all the data that's gathered by organisations and so on about how much time they can, how much of our attention they can harvest. Right. Okay. Are you still there? Because I can't see you anymore, but good. I'm not just talking to myself. Right, so in terms of attention, I think Latham again is interesting. So John talked about this last week, your presentation, this idea that he is using this time roller very much as a kind of a kind of instrument of demonstration. So it's got a very kind of pedagogic or didactic function, and there he is, a bit like kind of Boyce or something. He would take this kind of role and explain things on this little portable device. He also wrote hundreds of letters, so this is one thing that's in the archives, just all these letters, and they're quite kind of comical, some of them. I don't know, again, you never know with Latham how intentional he's being with the kind of comedy, but a lot of the work is quite comical, I think. But he's definitely got something to say. He's quite, monomaniacal about this these theories that he has. And this one he writes to Margaret Thatcher: "Dear Mrs. Thatcher," this is when she's Prime Minister, "I'm sending you notice of a very basic discovery that has arisen at the point where science and art both arrive at an otherwise unintelligible conclusion. Evidence for it has accumulated over the years since it first came into view. It has been obscured only by the nature of language itself in the meanwhile. The discovery amounts to a practical program which introduces a new kind of professional role, normally or previously performed by the artist in society. It is the development of such a role that needs approval at cabinet level." So very much trying to get attention at kind of top levels for this idea of a new role for the artist. And again, for me at least, very hard to kind of fathom or get to the bottom of exactly what Latham's getting at in terms of these things that are happening. But there's a kind of recurrence of in all his work, in all his writings, of trying to get this message across. Now I've put this less. Sometimes he got responses. There's a response from Noam Chomsky, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of entropy. It's quite funny. It says, "Dear John, your letter of last June and the event structure monograph were misplaced in a pile of things that came over the summer when I was away, and I've just found them. I look forward to reading the monograph about the queries you raised, which you've probably forgotten by now, about the media used by government. I wish I had something to say, but I really don't." There is actually another couple of lines about Noam Chomsky's new book that's coming out, which I've excised here, and then he signs it. But this is interesting. I just realised he actually misspelled pile. I didn't notice that before. Another kind of entropic kind of the way kind of information falls apart. But and quite maybe interesting in terms of Latham dictionaries and so on. But something becomes disordered. It's a pile of things you've forgotten, which is another form of kind of another kind of entropic process, forgetting. And I don't have anything to say about it anyway. Okay, so this is I guess this kind of comes from Mary's initial diagram, the triangle. So taking the triangle again, this kind of delta-shaped triangle, and bringing in these three figures. So this is something from an interview with Charles Harrison, where Latham describes this Scoob box. I haven't actually seen pictures of it, but I thought I'd try to kind of illustrate it just from the description. So he says in the Scoob box there's a mass on the low left wall. That's a random deposited junk, some books in it, but a heap of disorder. So this is Dimitri. This is the kind of Dimitri figure, heap of disorder. Dimitri represents instinct. And then he talks about on the adjacent wall at eye level there was a smaller mass, a more or less orderly library. So this is Ivan, and Ivan is the figure of reason. And then on the ceiling, hanging from the ceiling, there's a book, there's a light which is on, and there's a black light, which I'm not quite sure exactly how these things look. This is completely a kind of just quick scribble, giving an impression of this. But this is the kind of links between these three sides of the corners of the triangle. Okay, another triangle. Actually, the simplest equation for entropy, which comes from Clausius, who talked about the dissipation of energy as heat in the mid-19th century, actually uses a delta sign. So delta S is entropy, and entropy is always equal to or more than 0. So this is where the idea of an arrow of time comes in, and time irreversibility. So most processes in physics are actually reversible. I think, as we've discussed, and definitely what David was saying, Newtonian physics is time reversible. Electromagnetism is time reversible. Fundamental kind of atomic nuclear physics is time reversible. You replay the movie and it looks just the same. The Earth goes around the sun and so on, whichever way you play the movie. If basically, as I understand, if there's zeros in an equation, then it's time reversible. But in this equation, it's always more. It's never less than zero. So there's always a direction of travel. And as you can see from this little GIF here, which I just got from the internet, it's often represented this way in terms of order and disorder. So you start off from what looks like an ordered state, and over time it will. The point being, another way of thinking about this is in terms of probability. It's much more improbable that all these little whatever they are, atoms or molecules or particles, would be in those arrays arranged in that particular way, and it's much more probable that it would be in all the kind of millions of other kind of ways within this space. Right, and so how does art fit into this? So I think I was thinking about Bacon. I thought when David was talking about Terry Atkinson, that chair and that kind of physical process and the wax and all that stuff, I thought that was probably a reference to Bacon.
It's Greece, Dean. Just to
Greece. Sorry. The Greece. I thought that might have been a reference to a Bacon chair. That's what it looked like to me. One of those kind of electric chairs or something.
It's Warhol's chair.
It's Warhol. Okay.
I didn't say that at the time. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Yeah,
but I like Bacon Greece chair.
Bacon Greece chair. Might go back to Van Gogh's chair as well. With Bacon. But anyway, the point being, here's Bacon in his studio. Fantastically kind of messy studio. You're not really a real painter unless your studio looks like that. And incredibly well turned out as well, which is very, very impressive. And particularly the way his shirt seems to match the kind of daubs of paint all over the place. I mean, Deleuze in his book on Bacon and Bacon's diagram kind of makes a lot about this kind of chaos, having to get into this kind of state of chaos and then get out of it again as a kind of scrambling of scrambling out of certain kind of habits, I suppose, within the culture of painting and so on. But of course, he produces something. He produces a work of art that's then put in a frame. It's then put in a gallery and so on. But the interesting thing, I think, is the way that particularly in the 60s and 70s, artists became interested more in the mess, more in the kind of entropic, kind of disordering. So what you might find in the studio actually ended up in the gallery. So you can imagine something like this in the gallery. And in some ways, this image of the studio is more interesting maybe than the actual kind of painting. And interesting enough, when I was looking at these images, this is one of the few I could find for free. They're all on sale now. They're all that Shutterstock stuff. So this is Bacon in his studio is itself a kind of product because it's so kind of iconic, I guess. But as he's making order out of this disorder, which to him isn't disorder because this is the way he needs to order things in order to work, he's producing disorder. So he's kind of dissipating, he's creating entropy in the system. There's more entropy being created in the system as a whole, despite the fact that he's kind of putting together all this kind of seemingly messy situation into some kind of order. He's giving off heat, he's kind of expending, food and everything he needs to kind of live. And so there's more chaos or more disorder, more entropy being created, and this would go for any kind of constructive act. So these are a couple of examples of what I see as kind of Latham's kind of entropic processes. And obviously you have other artists like Smithson and lots of other people at that time in the 60s doing similar kind of things, which seem to be kind of destructive or seem to be kind of anti-form, not kind of pristine, but then somehow kind of ending up in a gallery situation, either as photographs or documents or in glass vitrines or little piles of stuff and so on. So with kind of the distress of the dictionary, again, a very kind of ordered system. Knowledge is organised matter, as Diderot says, and then placed in this way. Obviously did a lot of kind of stuff about cutting up these books, but also the burning is interesting because that's one of the fundamental or kind of the first really kind of definitions of entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics is that energy doesn't disappear. It's always there. It simply kind of displaces itself in other forms. But the thing about heat is you can never kind of reverse the system. So when something falls, let's say from a height, it produces heat, and you can never get that back into the object again. It's a dissipation of energy within the kind of wider system. Once you've burned a pile of books, you can't reconstruct the books from the ashes. I mean, possibly you could, but it would take an immense amount of energy and time to do that. So you'd lose far more energy than you'd ever kind of get out of the process again. So this is one of his clusters, which I like, and I said last week, I thought, think of these as kind of allegories, really. Possibly an allegory of time without space or something, where everything would be in the same place. But it also made me think of the formation of suns. So this idea that the universe started in a state of low entropy or even zero entropy, and then it gradually becomes more and more entropic. But you get these little enclaves, these little kind of islands of very low entropy, and this is due to the effects of gravity. So it's only gravity that kind of pulled these balls of dust together, forming suns, which we then all feed off. We all feed off we get all our energy from the low entropy of the sun. We kind of catch it in the way that we might catch a waterfall as it falls to the ground and put it to work in some way. But once it's fallen, it's gone, it's lost, unless we then expend a lot of energy to build a dam and so on. But I was looking for I once made a little clipping of a long time ago of a newspaper article, and this was in the 90s, and it was about what was happening in the 90s in Russia at that time, and the economy had completely collapsed, and new kind of privatized energy companies were kind of cutting people's supplies off that hadn't paid the bills for years, and so on. And they were saying that people have started burning books, and particularly popular are the collections of Marx and Lenin, because they were kind of if I remember, they were in plentiful supply, and they were very, very thick, so they would create a lot of energy. So there's a kind of potential energy or kind of stored chemical energy within these books that suddenly are able to release this heat, this kind of increased entropy that you can then make use of by keeping warm. But of course it can never be put back together again. Luckily, Marx and Lenin's works are collected archived all over the place, so it's not the end. And I'll talk about archives. This is the archive. So this is a question I want to kind of come on to as I get towards the end, but how does piles of stuff, piles of disorder, maybe the little pile in Chomsky's office, or the piles of stuff in the studio, or all the kind of thousands of studios that exist. How do they end up archived? How do they end up in boxes? How do they end up in a situation where people will pay attention to them? So how do they connect to this attention unit? So that's my kind of ultimate aim. I'll just show a couple of timeline images, and then maybe we can just break and have a bit of a conversation, then I'll carry on. These timelines, art timelines, obviously they're very familiar to people. This is a famous one by Barr, from the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's going from it's kind of the history of cubism and abstract art, how it all connects, and there's definitely there's definitely a movement, there's definitely a timeline, although things connect, but the arrows are going forward in time. The other one is is obviously a fan of Rousseau, and is using the metaphor of the tree, coming from kind of family trees and that kind of thing. But again, it's a timeline. We can infer a timeline. It's going up. I mean, interestingly, with trees, the roots are growing as well. So there's potentially a more interesting timeline going in both directions here. But obviously, he's not he's not taking us underneath the ground. We're kind of going up in a more kind of organic way rather than going forward in this more machinic kind of structured kind of way. This is, I think, John, you showed this last week. This is John Latham's timeline, which obviously is more interested in the events and the connection between art and philosophy and physics, and these moments of event, I guess, the moments when they kind of correlate or correspond. And I'll just show this finally, and then I'll shut up for a bit. But this is kind of interesting, I think, in terms of this. I guess this is something I've been interested in for a long time. I suppose as someone who never really considered I had a kind of early art career, but this kind of trajectory of the early, late career artist and the way that's kind of talked about. You have a kind of a notion of emergence as well, the kind of emerging artists. And this is a very kind of strict, structured kind of timeline where you go from the early to the mid to the late, and it's all very neat. And in your late career, you'll have a kind of museum show or something. After your death, there'll be a kind of legacy, and you'll be, in the collections and so on. What happens if you didn't have an early career? I don't know. Can you then go back in time? So going back in time is a bit like Benjamin's kind of messianic time. This is the event where something happens and you have to go back, and a kind of early career is retrospectively constructed. So a very good example of this is what's been happening with Black Lives Matter at the moment, where museums are really having to kind of rethink, what is it we've got here? What is the history? Why isn't there kind of black artists, a very few? You could say the same with female artists as well. And suddenly there's a kind of backward time travel, a kind of event intervenes, and things have to be reconstructed, and people's careers and artists have to be kind of paid attention to and brought out and being put into a position where they can be paid attention to. So there's this kind of reconstructed art career in terms of the individual, but maybe more broadly as well in terms of the general culture. Things shift around. Right. So I might just stop for the moment just to see if there's any. I've got more, but I'll just break in case you want to say anything. Otherwise, I can just carry on.
I had a few things to say. They're not really perhaps profound, but I've enjoyed it very much so far, Dean. Thanks. So when you were telling your story about the burning of the Marxist and Leninist books, it made me remember something when I used to work in this warehouse in Hackney Wick for Central Books, because Central Books was is still going, and it was set up by the Communist Party to allow the Soviet Union to fund the British Communist Party, which they did through this book warehouse. So there was a kind of financial deal, and the warehouse, after the Berlin Wall fell down, it was run by these very nice people. They had to work out what to do. Did they either like stop because no money was coming, or did they become businessmen and women, which was really difficult for them because they were good communists. But they did become businessmen and women, and they made a lot of money, which I think made them always guilty. And they couldn't throw away all the Marxist and Leninist books. And I remember on my first week of work, I went to the top floor, and there was loads and loads of books on pallets, which were covered in dust. And I'm not joking. I dusted one down, and it was Marx's surplus value. It's a good joke, that.
It is.
Yeah.
So that made me think of something, though, that you mentioned last week, which was negentropy, which I guess is the kind of it could be thought of as a storing or an ordering of a kind. Well, negentropy is meant to be the idea of ordering, isn't it, or things being in order.
Yeah, it comes from Claude Shannon, I think, came up with that. So it's the way that entropy relates to information theory, communication.
But also, we store food and we store energy. And I was just wondering about whether the archive is, if that's how you see the archive as a kind of negentropy, which is kind of, I don't know if it's within Latham's notion of the time event or time-based event world. And
yeah,
the thing about the timeline, I know you're not suggesting this, but we shouldn't think of time as this flow of time. But it's the kind of the events, isn't it? The change that comes about through an event, and because we know of relativity and the universe, there's not a kind of single flow of time, or time is more complex than.
Yeah, I'm going to come on to that because I'm going to talk a little bit about Rovelli and his ideas of time not really existing.
But I wonder, there's all sorts of things to say about the archive, but I wonder whether you think about it, or maybe you want to leave it for later. But
I think the archive, it's interesting because obviously, I guess part of this project is to look at is for someone to pay attention to the archive, and I guess we've only scratched the surface really. So the first thing is to order. I'm interested in the work that goes into forming an archive, even the thought process, even the kind of, the amount of people it kind of takes to decide that something is worth archiving and something is not worth archiving. After that point, it's still a question of who pays attention to it, but there is then potential that somebody will, because it is all kind of collected and it's kind of ordered to an extent on the website and in the boxes and so on. But I think in terms of hundreds of years, it might not matter. Thousands of years, millions of years, it definitely won't. So I think it is quite interesting to think of these things in terms of time spans and.
But in the historical messianic timeline of the artists, which is it's interesting in relation to that, because I think I suggested in the first session that the archive was something like a kind of AI survival of Latham, and then in your timeline there's the kind of death moment, which is an event, I guess, rather than entropy, but the death itself is possibly a kind of entropic moment, like leads to kind of a rapid entropy in relation to most people. They kind of disappear or dissipate. maybe that's wrong, but the archive is definitely a kind of negentropic attempt to kind of forestall that and survive and remain as this kind of ordered entity, maybe somewhat transformed in some way.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's quite interesting in terms of attention as well. I mean, can't say too much about this because it's a bit off topic, but this whole kind of question of the attention economy is it is really a lot to do with how much work goes into establishing conditions in which somebody's attention could be paid to something in the first place. So yes, absolutely. I mean, it was obviously very important for Latham because he obviously considered what he had to say, which seemed to really transcend, any kind of usual notion of art, what art is, to be incredibly important, to the extent that he was writing to Margaret Thatcher and and Stephen Hawking and all these people, with sincerity. I always think there was a kind of sense of humour attached to it, but I don't know. I might be wrong, but I always kind of think there was a kind of sense, because you see that overspilling sometimes. I think with Latham that there is a kind of excess, let's say, a kind of surplus of language, which is quite entertaining when it comes to the notices for the performances and events and stuff that's going on. So there does seem to be that. But yeah, it was obviously important that this stuff carries on to be investigated and to be kind of considered. And
and I was thinking of Hilma af Klint, who we've kind of discussed a lot, who didn't have a kind of early or mid-career in the way that
absolutely not.
But now they, like you're saying with Black Lives Matter,
not till quite recent, not till 50 years after a death or something, right?
The other thing that was really interesting was the delta, or the delta diagram of attention, and it made me think, like I've mentioned before, this idea of 3 levels of embodiment, and the first level, which comes from Metzinger, the neuroscience philosopher. So the first level is non-conscious, and I guess that would be the instinct model. And the second level of reason, I was thinking, well, is that equivalent to the phenomenal self, which would be Metzinger's notion, which is basically knowing where it's like a kind of illusion of consciousness, of like where you start and stop. But I thought also it was like equivalent to scanning, which relates to a notion of that Lyotard has. Then the final level, where we've been discussing intuition, the third level of embodiment would be the ability to make global maps that you can move around in. And it seems so. I mean, it's obvious to me, but it just clicked that the intuition bit, maybe that Latham is so concerned with, is to do with this ability to kind of image, or the kind of imaginary level, as I would see, which is why art and images, as opposed to equations, are what he's interested in. And that it just clicked for me when you it's an obvious thing that probably you'd all realise, but it just clicked for me when you showed that the level of attention. But that implies to me that it's not just attention, it's not just signals in kind of at a kind of first or second level as well. There's another kind of process going on there with the kind of global model, or the image making, which I don't want to say is inside us, but it's a kind of virtualizing mechanism somehow, intuition. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
And I think that, maybe the interesting thing about the hits, I immediately thought, well, some of them will be bots,
Yeah.
and they don't have that third level, which is not a criticism of the bots, but just to distinguish between, things that
Yeah, they
might have
don't. They don't have a third level, no.
not
But they're
yet
still
anyway.
they're still interpretants, aren't they? In a Persian sense, they're
Yeah,
still receivers of the message.
the
So
neural
they're
net, the neural net AIs. I don't know enough about it, but they might.
yeah.
But so yeah, that was really helpful for me. That diagram.
Yeah, I think for Latham they are all connected. It's the kind of connection that's important between them, like in Mary's diagram that she showed. But I was kind of interested in that because of the piles of rubbish. It was like we're going from, as we step up levels, let's say, if you want to put it like that, towards this ideal of intuition, which is the ideal for Latham. We're getting there's decreasing entropy, you might say. There's the pile of rubbish. I think he says that the first guy can't get he can't get out of his rubbish. He can't kind of get out of it somehow. It's like Bacon got stuck in the studio or something. So he's using similar materials, but they're more ordered or less disordered, I think.
Well,
Which would be which would be Claude Shannon's kind of definition of communication, of kind of negentropic, the less noise, he would describe it in terms of less noise down the line or something, And
sorry, yeah, I've got something to say there, but John, you want to say something?
No, Mary was also trying
Mary,
to say something.
The Bacon diagram that you made when he was standing in his studio, and then you added a diagrammatic element to it, and I think it said that there were wavy lines above him going up towards chaos. So I was wondering if you could say more about that, because is he working through the chaos in order to produce something more ordered, which is the artwork, or is the artwork just more chaos, which is some kind of imaginative splurge of
well, it's the idea that this was you've got to remember that entropy, like a lot of these things, they came out of a practical problem, which was the Industrial Revolution, and how to kind of exploit kind of steam engines and not try not to lose too much kind of work to the heat that they were kind of giving off. Things get everything, all our devices get very, very hot, don't they? And my fan is incredibly loud at the moment. I don't know I don't know how to fix that problem, but things get hot. But the second law of thermodynamics basically says that when things get hot, you can't put them back again. Like, you can't get the heat back again, because heat will always dissipate energy. It will always move towards a colder place rather than moving back towards a hotter place. So I've got a few more slides where I'll say a bit more about that, but it's almost like a kind of misconception that because humans, at least the good kind of functional humans or whatever, they're actually doing things, although people might not think that way about artists, particularly kind of bohemians like Bacon, but they're creating more order than disorder. But this is factually inaccurate. Like, physically, this is inaccurate. Whatever kind of order you're creating, whether you're making equations or building a house or making a painting or whatever, you're always giving off more, you're dissipating more energy as heat than you are creating lower states of entropy. So the entropy balance is always, as in that equation, it's always more than zero. So it's not the first law of this. Goes back to the surplus value thing that David was talking about. It was a good joke, because I've got a slide exactly about that, actually. And I think I was triggered by John's remarks about Marxist last week, but I was thinking a lot about Marx, particularly with time and that. But the first law says that it's a zero-sum game. There is really no surplus. It's a zero-sum game. But the second law is even worse because you actually get back less than you put in. You'd always get back less, and that's why you'll eventually have this heat death of the universe. We're just in this limited time span of so many millions of years, what we call life on Earth has kind of exploited the fact that we have this great big waterfall of energy and we get in its way and manage to kind of, use that energy to do things like to, not just to survive, but to kind of make culture, so... Yeah, you can be very productive and constructive, but you'll always be part of the problem of the heat death of the universe ultimately. But luckily the sun has got a few more billion years to burn out, so we're just living on that time or whatever. So. But it's a nice image. I mean, someone like Smithson is very, very interested in that. Obviously, I mean. What's interesting to me is why Latham, I don't know, it's not a criticism. I see it in his work, so I wondered why he didn't say more about it, because, as far as I know anyway, because of its intimate connection with time, which he is so interested in. But it might be to do with the fact that he's against gravity as well. I don't know, as David was saying.
Dean, I had just 4 points. I'll try to be very quick in response. And the first one is that I was very struck at the beginning that Latham talked about total economics, and he says holo economics ?
Oh yeah, that's right.
And we've talked a lot about, well, we haven't talked a lot, but Bataille keeps coming back, and I was sort of struck by how different and similar total economics would be from general economics. And of course, general economics is the idea that everything is energy, all life is trapped energy from the sun. But the problem is not maintaining that energy, it's expending that energy. So it's a solonomic thing. So that was the first thing, and I think that this question of entropy was in Bataille, the question of expenditure and waste. And I think this tension between negentropy and entropy, ordering and work, and waste, or what Philip K. Dick would call kipple, that you actually become surrounded by the waste products of your attempt to work, and you eventually are kind of swallowed up by all the crap you try to put aside in your attempt to create the work. I was very reminded of that, Bacon in his studio, surrounded by all the detritus of the work, which is the waste product, the non-productive stuff, in order to create this. So I really recognize this, work produces surplus waste that isn't productive. So I was just struck by that, and a lot of what you've been talking about. So the other thing is this a question of the attention economy, and it's interesting that this idea of paying attention, it's something that I remember from school. You were told to pay attention. It was a disciplinary order, right? That if you didn't pay attention, you'd be in trouble. So there's something disciplinary about it. Mm. And yesterday, for instance, and this must be common to all of us in education now, for instance, we all have students who are on their mobile phones in the middle of a lecture or a presentation. And there was one just in front of me as I was talking about something, and I just said, what are you doing? And it's very common. He said, oh, sorry, yeah. I said, what are you actually doing? She said, I was on Snapchat. And I said, we're talking about the digital, perception, we're doing all that stuff. And anyway, what I'm trying to get at by that, it was a funny anecdote. She was very, we could have talked about it, and I would have actually really been as interested in what's going on with her consciousness and awareness, that she's like more captured by Snapchat than the lecture. It's not about, I'm sure Snapchat's probably more interesting in some ways for her attention.
I can't believe that.
No, of course not. But
it gives you more dopamine hits, doesn't it? It's very much to do with dopamine hits, how attention is gathered. But it is an addiction. It's recognised as an addiction, so that's how it functions.
And that attention is really captured by those machines. And so, I agree. And I was thinking about ADHD and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which was invented it was a diagnostic category, let's say, about 30 years ago or something, and that was linked to these awarenesses of how attention was being transformed, let's say. So, yeah, I was just struck by that. And finally, just one more thing I wanted to say, which I was really struck by, the slip in Chomsky's reply to Latham, because this thing about the pile and the ply is that, a pile can be disordered or it can be ordered. And an ordered pile is more like a ply in the sense that, it's layers of the same stuff built up. There's something about this sense of the ordered pile and the disordered pile that seems to be very, very Latham, because on one hand there's the chaos of the destroyed books, the entropy, although he doesn't use that term, and the kind of the burning and the destruction and the wastage. And then there's this move towards the ordering of the archive. And there is definitely this very strong tension between works that seem to be about the expenditure and wastage and in time, and this other negentropic work of ordering. And I think we're all encountering a kind of contradiction in Latham between this push and pull of ordering and disordering or destroying. So I guess I just think that plea was a very, again, le pli, which is more the fold than the pile, but there is stuff going on in that slip.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's funny. I actually never noticed it until I just read it out then. But I think I meant to actually talk a little bit about in terms of what you were saying, the kind of entropic processes in Latham. If you think about the famous one, the Chew and Spit Greenberg Art and Culture book, he's obviously subjecting that book to a kind of process which you can't really put together. But the fact that he does then put it together in another formulation, let's say, in a little vial, hands it back to the librarian, it's now an artwork. I mean, it is an ordered structure. It's just taken another form. And obviously a lot of artists were kind of interested in that dialectical tension, you might say, between the formless and how the formless, just on a practical level, and art, at least art when it gets to gallery level, and very much when it gets to museum level, is always a question of practicality, which is why kinetic sculpture is a silly thing to do. But it's like you want to show the disorder, like the Terry Atkinson or whatever, but then how is it kind of preserved, how is it conserved, or how does it even stand up so we can pay attention to that, so we can kind of formulate a kind of thought about something which has become, maybe a kind of analogy or a kind of poetic metaphor or something like that. So we're kind of thinking about this pile now in a different way than we would, a big load of crap in our piled up in our bedroom or something like that. So yeah, there's always that. There's always that dialectic, I think, in Latham between kind of destroying something, through some event, and then kind of reconstructing it, put it back together, putting it in glass, putting it in I think he ended up with those vials, putting them in a suitcase or something, which is very Duchampian actually, that you end up with a little box full of tricks, and again, the way that people talk about Duchamp now as a kind of a messy artist in a way, like conceptually messy, interested in those processes that don't get tied up, don't kind of, the knots don't get kind of tied up neatly, but kind of tend to disperse and go all over the place. But the form that you kind of present that in looks like something kind of from a kind of laboratory or something, which can easily be displayed, again, a bit like maybe like a salesman would display, samples or something like that. So yeah, and the Bataille, I mean, that's the Bataille thing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so Bataille actually. I mean, it's a whole other kind of, wormhole really to go down, but it is, particularly the relation to economy. That's really, really interesting. The relation between matter and economy.
I think the Atkinson grease works are in, or particularly the Warhol greaser, which turns and indexes, if not entropy, certainly like the effects of gravity on the work. And
Yeah.
I think that goes some way. That's like a different approach to Latham's, which is have an event and archive it as I see it. And I'm not saying it's better, but it's actually it's very original. I can't think of anything else that's like that. I was just going to say, I wanted to say something about attention, but just an interesting thing about the gravity fear that Latham has. It's not that he's against gravity in that he kind of, no, I'm not being critical of you, Dean. I'm just like thinking about it. He kind of acknowledges that it exists, but at the quantum level,
the graviton. He wrote.
He did, yeah. And
I mean, he basically said,
if it's there, if the graviton exists, if there's gravity at the quantum level, that's the end of my theory. Yeah. But I think that that's unfortunate.
Why is that, David? What's he getting at there?
Because
I think understand that.
Because
why is it the end of his theory if the graviton exists?
Because I think it's premised on the idea that there's nothing spatial. It's all to do with what zero is, and zero is like entropy is not meant to exist at the quantum level. There's no time at the quantum level, which is why the many physicists think that I think space is what exists and not time. But I think it's to do with this idea of events. But if there's a kind of I don't know enough really to say this with conviction, but if there is if a graviton exists at the quantum level and it carries gravity, basically, that means that there's a link between the gravity at the level that we experience it and the quantum. And for Latham, that would blow his understanding of the universe apart, I think. But I think he probably would have he probably would and should have revised it. But I just wanted to say something about the attention economy and what John said about the Snapchat. Like going back to Metzinger, the 3 levels of embodiment would be a hierarchy. So the first level, which is non-conscious, which may be equivalent to instinct. People working on AI, there are 2 ways at least 2 ways, as I understand it, of thinking about kind of AI. One is emergent AI, which is the idea that you make a machine and it learns from its environment how to deal with it. And the other, which is a more Kurzweil idea, is to put a global map in a machine. And there's some story where Kurzweil was trying to make this cockroach by having a global map in a machine, and it couldn't get round the classroom. It wasn't a cockroach, rather, it was a machine, but it couldn't get round a room. And someone in the class, a kind of contemporary, just thought, how is it a cockroach could get round a room without, but this machine with this intelligence couldn't. So that's the kind of base level, the non-conscious level of embodiment. And then the phenomenal self-model, which is like we have it, cats have it, or whatever. It's where we have this model of where we start and stop, which I guess is based on our senses. And then the highest level, because it is a hierarchy, is the global image that we have of the world, past, future, whatever, as well, I guess, is in there. For Metzinger, that you can't have the third level, through experimentation this is, because he hoped it was different, you can't have the third level without the first level. So I don't know in Latham whether he thinks you can have you have to have that hierarchy of the 3 of Dimitri, Ivan and Alyosha, Is that how you say it? Holosha. Holosha.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is Metzinger thinks that the second level of phenomenal self-model level is why there's an illusion of the ego and the I, because the processing of the world, which says there's me and then there's the world, creates this kind of ego tunnel. And he wants to think about and explore whether it's possible to have the first level of the non-conscious with the phenomenal self-model, and at least be aware of the illusions of the second level. So I think I just thought whether maybe there's something more to be done with Latham's model, which tends to separate things out and doesn't think about the relations of those three people, because supposedly we're all those people in some way, Ivan, Dmitry, and Alosha. But then I thought when John said about Snapchat, it reminded me of The Man Who Fell to Earth and Thomas Jerome, played by David Bowie, who's the alien that can watch, 50 televisions all at once. And his then kind of girlfriend partner walks in and says, "How can you deal with all these TVs?" She just hears it as noise. But the alien has a different body, I guess, and can watch all those televisions and can process all those signals. So there's a kind of level of entropy, of noise that we hear. But the question for me is whether technology as a kind of extension of of embodiment and the body, not just as a kind of like add-on prosthetic, but actually as extending our body, will move us more towards different levels of attention. And it's not so much that the attention economy is bad as such, because in a way we can see into space now, supposedly. It's not the actual extension of our looking and our attention. That's the problem with technology. The problem is elsewhere with the content of Snapchat or what it's used
I
for.
think it's the addictive kind of dopamine. It's all based on kind of gambling. Kind of one-armed bandits and that kind of thing. I mean, that's where the theory comes from of how to develop these things, but are obviously much more sophisticated now, because you're talking about people actually responding to stuff that you've put out there, desperately hoping that somebody likes you.
In a Lacanian, I don't know if it's just that though, because if we're allowed to move to sort of psychoanalysis here, there is this notion of the discourse of the capitalist, which Levi Bryant has written about, and it's the idea that enjoyment is got through cutting out the other. Mm-hmm. And the drug addict, the porn addict, the Snapchat addict gets their enjoyment, and I think that's what the technology kind of does. I guess it's a kind of, I don't know, but I guess that would be based on a kind of narcissism where you completely cut out the other. It's not about what you want from the other and what the other wants from you. It's about getting your enjoyment.
Can I just a comment quickly, David, on that the Man Who Fell to Earth is a great example. I've been using sort of Bowie a lot to try and teach. I'm not sure if it's working or just making me look older than them. But it's interesting that in that scene in The Man Who Fell to Earth, not only is he watching all the screens, he's also getting drunk. Yeah. And he's developing an addiction. And his breakdown with his relationship with his partner has to do both with simultaneously with the taking in all this information simultaneously about all the things that humans are doing and how insane it is. It's like a society, the spectacle moment. He's also drinking more and more, and he actually has a kind of nervous breakdown as a consequence of this absorbing information and taking in a substance which is making his brain change.
I'm not sure he has a nervous breakdown because he takes in information, because he's able to do that on Mars, where he comes from in the book. What he does do is drink, and he doesn't get drunk, but he sees things. He hallucinates. But he also says the thing about television is it tells you everything and nothing. as well. And I think that he's obviously a figure of alienation, and I'm not sure it's the information, it's more the kind of being alienated, and he misses his wife. He can't reveal himself,
It's seeking a self through the screen and through the information delivered by screens seems to be part of it. And but again, I'm not in any way making this is really purely conjectural, and it's not based on any evidence. It was I just drew a parallel between you were talking about.
Yeah.
Dean keeps talking about addiction with
my point
mobile
in raising
phones,
it,
and there was this link with alcohol and the changing state of the brain. So I was just.
Well, if you ask people, even me, why they're looking at their phones, they don't really know. It's just that there will be something there to look at. Hopefully,
well, notifications, right? There's constantly notifying you.
Yeah.
Like there's a new notification, however meaningless, and something about notifications really does have this effect. I think it's a reflex effect. You get the notification, you have to look at it. Get the notification,
and it's directed at your attention specifically. It's not like watching telly, which is for a broadcast for a general audience. This is absolutely directed. I think it's more than I think. Yeah, I think it's. I don't know if it's. I don't. Obviously, there is a kind of overlap here, but I think it is to do with. It's to do with the kind of social anxiety that we all have as kind of humans. There's a social anxiety, a need for belonging, a need for recognition, all those kind of things. So that obviously overlaps with the objectification, because obviously this is all objectified. It's all turned into attention units, as Latham would say. It's just in the way, it's a currency, right? I think it's pretty much happened, and I think there's an episode of Black Mirror where it does function, currency does function completely on in terms of these new kind of attention markers or whatever you want to call them. And you can see that happening. But and obviously the Chinese government uses that in certain ways and whatever. So.
But my point in raising Thomas Jerome is I've read the book as well. He doesn't have, I think, the same breakdown. But he's able to process these signals. And I guess I'm just wondering whether there's also a case to be made about how technology might function to extend our attention. Like it's not the same, is it? It's always, like we've always been post-human in a way. We've always, as humans, I could say as humans, in different ways, our attention has developed. Like there's a case study that Alfred Joel writes about these people who live in a forest in which there's no horizon line, and all their language is different, and it's based much more on kind of what the substance of things are. And they were apparently, a lot of them were kidnapped for slavery purposes, and they were taken to a beach, and they watched one of the people that captured them stand in front of the sea, which they could only see as a wall of water, and they couldn't understand why the wall of water didn't fall on them. And apparently also they escaped, but they didn't realise the distance that they travelled was so great that they could kind of see the mountain in the distance, but they couldn't understand why they couldn't just get to it. So I guess the point I'm raising, as well as there's kind of negative effects about attention, there's also the fact that our attention evolves in some way, and that might not always be negative, I think. But that's not to disagree with what any of you have said.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I've got 6 more slides to show, so should I show them? Because I've got maybe stuff that links to that, but I'd rather show the image and then. Okay, pay attention. Exactly. So this is a little I guess, a kind of representation of this famous kind of thought experiment by James Clerk Maxwell in the 19th century. Maxwell's Demon, it's called. So, I mean, this is a particular problem, and it's this problem of kind of, I guess, ultimately it would be kind of perpetual motion. You know, why do things wear down? Why, if there was only a way to keep the difference between two levels, hot and cold, fast-moving molecules and small, slower-moving molecules or atoms, then you could maintain that difference and you could exploit that to do work. So he imagines this little demon, and there's a little doorway in this box with kind of two sides, and every time he spots a kind of fast-moving or atom, he just kind of sticks it on the fast-moving side, so he maintains the difference. Now, of course, this doesn't actually work, because where's the demon getting his energy from to do that? He's having to work to do this, and even at the level of computers, which is how a lot of people are interested in this problem now, you're always expending energy. Even in terms of memory, so even to kind of remember what you've got and what you need to get, memory. When a computer puts something into memory, it leaves a little mark. So this really goes to a kind of interesting question that kind of Carlo Rovelli talks about, and kind of reminds me a lot of Freud, to go back to psychoanalysis, and this question of, he talks about it in terms of the mystic writing pad. So when you have a memory is basically a kind of a little thought that has left a trace. We now talk about this in terms of synapses. The synapses kind of come and go, but they leave a little trace when they go. And then we might have a kind of vague memory of something. This is actually kind of the way Rovelli describes what time is. Every time something leaves a trace, a little bit of heat is dissipated. But as soon as something leaves a trace, there is a difference between past and future. If nothing left a trace, there wouldn't be any difference between past and future, and the equations would be reversible. Now, this is another kind of cutting, actually. Had some kind of cuttings at some point, which is about, I guess, separation. I want to talk about this question of separation, because I want to define this question of attention and this question of entropy, or kind of anti-entropy or negentropy, in terms of separation. So we could think about crossing a border, right? So this is just the most kind of incredible kind of image of, this is a Mexican man who's trying to cross the border into the United States. He's trying to get through the migration crossing, the border crossing, and they find him disguised as a chair in a bus, in a coach. And I always imagine somebody sitting on him for some reason. I always imagine him like somebody would have to actually sit on that chair to him to be fully a chair. Now, I like the image because it's so, it's quite depressing in a lot of ways, but it shows a real kind of ingenuity. But it's really this guy becoming chair, I guess, in a kind of Deleuzian way. But he's kind of figured out an ingenious way to pass this border, right, to get from one side of the box to the other side, where there's a little demon, a little kind of gatekeeper, who is stopping people from kind of, he wants to keep them separated, right? So it reminds me of some of the Latham stuff with the books and so on as well. But it's a kind of horrific image, really. But this is what happens with entropy. Things kind of collapse into one another. When you die, you will kind of disintegrate into everything that surrounds you. So here we come to Marx, and what I think the thing that's interesting to me about the attention economy is this question of how time is now directed to us as consumers, rather than time being directed to us as workers. So our time is exploited in terms of how much of our time we'll pay attention to this particular thing, where someone can kind of then make some money out of that on the basis that we will spend our own money on the thing that we've been paying attention to. So Marx's whole theory, and again, I kind of linking this to the idea of a kind of entropic process. Marx talks about value. Well, what is value? Economic value, commodity value is congealed labour. So labour in general, this is how we can quantify things. This is how we can have money. This is how commodities can be defined in terms of a kind of equation that makes them all kind of equal according to specific units that we can easily calculate. And this is the commodity fetishism, right? This is why commodities are social beings, because they relate to each other through the pricing system, through money, and humans become these kind of object-like things within this kind of process. The specific skills it takes from all our capacities as humans, all our kind of senses and nerves and brain power and muscle power, all the kind of skills we develop, the very kind of intricate, particular skills that we learn through apprenticeships and through actually doing things and discovering things, are congealed. I mean, Marx uses this word congealed a lot, a bit like the guy in the seat becoming a seat. You kind of become this completely homogenized thing in order for that to then translate into a purely kind of quantified system of money, right? So the particularity of any particular commodity and the particularity of any particular set of skills that is needed in a particular working process to make that commodity is generalized and all lumped together. So all the people who make this in the entire world and through the entire system get lumped together and calculated in terms of what he calls socially necessary labour time. That's ultimately what we mean when we use prices to determine the relation between things. But also, Marx is writing in the 19th century, he's writing during this time of the Industrial Revolution, steam power and so on, that's the factories. It's before electrification, really. And it's interesting, this idea of surplus that, David, you mentioned earlier with your anecdote, because it seems to me that what Marx's whole theory is really saying, and this is his whole theory of exploitation, is that profit is like the first law of thermodynamics. In other words, you don't get something out of nothing. But the trick when it all becomes homogenized, when it all gets turned into numbers, is that it seems by some miracle that the capitalist has made a profit through his sheer ingenuity, whatever, whereas actually, according to the Marxist theory, this is surplus value, right? This is the value that you don't get paid. But you don't know you're not getting paid because there's not a little clock that goes off in the office or whatever that tells you your kind of wage time has stopped and now the kind of surplus value is being produced that makes the profits. So I thought there's a kind of interesting link there. But I now want to come on to the really interesting stuff, which is this is the Carlo Rovelli, the physicist. He's written these very kind of popular, very, very good books. He's written this one about time, and he himself is involved in a kind of quantum loop theory, which I think David might have talked about before. So a way, this is, like I've said before, a way that entropy is often talked about is in terms of order and disorder. But Rovelli, who like Latham doesn't really believe in space. He believes in time, but he also doesn't really believe in time. He believes in events like Latham, but he thinks it's not events and time. He says it's events and relations. In other words, it's relativity. It's all about relativity, and time is relative. And entropy is a kind of function, if you like, of that relativity of time. So when we talk about order, what are we actually talking about? Order is relative. So he gives the example of like a pack of cards. This is not the exact example he uses, but I'll put it this way. If you had a pack of cards and they were all shuffled up, and then you shuffled them again, and then you looked at them, and all the first half of the cards that you then counted happened to be red, and the bottom half happened to be black. This would be astonishing, right? This would be so unlikely. So entropy is a kind of measure of probability. This would be so improbable that you would have created this order. It might not happen if you've been shuffling the cards for several years non-stop or something. But another way of thinking about it is, well, that's just as likely as any other system. It's just that for you, that has a kind of significance. The fact that they're red on top and they're black at the bottom has a kind of significance. But it's just an order like any other order would be equally as unlikely, right? So we can now talk about entropy in terms of a kind of blurring. The disorder is really a blurring. It's the kind of things that we don't pay attention to, the things that we can't really see, the things that we can't really focus on, the things that don't allow us to separate out some kind of pattern, some kind of significance, some kind of distinction. I'm using that word distinction because I want to come back to this idea of art. So I'm really thinking about Pierre Bourdieu here and what he talks about in terms of aesthetic judgment being about distinction in kind of both senses of that term. But this distinction is really a kind of question of separation. So if you happen to separate out these red dots, that is simply because these are the things that have some kind of specialness for you, or for some reason you're paying attention to, rather than any other pattern of dots, atoms, or however you want to think of these things, particles of dust or whatever. Molecules in water, Brownian motion distribution, any other particular kind of order. I mean, it's almost I was thinking a bit like kind of von Oikel here, and the way that he would think of how things change depending on the significance they have for different kind of animal life. For example, the one and the same object will have completely different functions. It will be seen in completely different ways. Things that are important for us will be not important for a dog or for a cockroach or a mold or something. So I have the eye here. This is the Guston eye. The eye is looking, it's paying attention, and it's sitting in judgment as well. It's a kind of judging eye, in a bit like the way John was saying. So this is called kind of coarse graining in the kind of physics. And it's this idea that if time is really a kind of question of entropy is really a question of what we pay attention to. So if we think of a move from disorder to order, it really depends on what we're thinking about order is. And because this is relative, then it's really specific. It's a kind of perspectival thing. He says it's not subjective, but it is perspectival. It's just like when you say, you need to turn left. You don't know what I mean when I say you need to turn left in terms of the map, unless you see me or you know what direction I'm facing. So it's indexical in the sense that a map is useless unless there's some indexicality to tell you exactly, you are here on the map. So this is what we pay attention to. And because leaving a mark is a dissipation of heat, because we're able to leave marks, that means we can have some kind of notion of cause and effect. If we weren't able to leave a mark, then we wouldn't make any connection between the past, the present, and the future. Everything would just be like it would if you were, a little subatomic particle floating about. It wouldn't really matter. There's just a kind of random. Every arrangement is a random arrangement, right? So this is how he imagines it. Some people really hate this idea, they think it's actually conservative. It's kind of conservative in terms of the radicality of entropy actually establishing an arrow of time. Other people think it's actually radical for disturbing our kind of human-centered or mammal-centered or whatever notions of time. So my question is, in art, what gets separated out? What is the special, distinct things that get separated? So this is my kind of timeline in a way. And imagine that this timeline is only really functioning according to the attention that we pay to things. So if you think about it in terms of art, like if you're an artist or consider yourself an artist at least some of the time, first of all, you've got this problem of like how to separate out enough time for yourself to actually make something approaching art, right? So in this sense, life is the blur. We'll call life the blur with all its problems and, things that need attending to and so on. And we focus our attention on something like a studio helps. So we actually have this space in which we can create some kind of order that we will call making art or thinking about art or being an artist during the time I'm there. It doesn't have to be a studio. It could just be a laptop or something. It could be just some time that you have every now and again, or it could be a course that you're on or whatever. Now, the thing about this is that this is only one kind of level, because then we enter on the level of the studio. You're in the studio and the studio itself becomes a blur, a bit like the kind of Francis Bacon image. So this in itself now becomes disorder, becomes chaos, and how to construct some order out of this chaos, out of this disorder, some kind of negentropic situation, which we'll call an artwork. So here the attention is focused on the artwork that we make. But again, there's a next level. The next level is, well, there's this artwork, there's that artwork, there's millions of artworks all over the world. How does this artwork now kind of attain a certain kind of particularity, a certain kind of pattern of order that would establish itself culturally within the kind of beyond your own mind, your own heads, as an artwork? So here the artwork itself becomes a kind of general blur. The dots go outside the boxes because this just shows that this is kind of happening outside the limited situations anyway, and can kind of dissipate in that direction. But the artwork here becomes a blur that is then put in a situation where people can pay attention to it and take it seriously as art within an exhibition. Okay, so it's in the galleries, the White Cube Gallery, famously, a great kind of metaphor for this kind of isolation in which we pay attention to something, even if it's a big pile of rubbish, a big heap of dirt or burnt books or whatever it is. But again, the same thing happens to the exhibition. The exhibition is thousands of exhibitions all the time. Who actually goes to them? Who's got time? Who pays attention to them? So they exist within this kind of general blur, this kind of vague awareness that there's stuff happening here, there and everywhere. Or you missed it, or has it started yet, or whatever. So in this sense, something I'll just generally loosely call discourse kicks in which we can pay attention to this particular exhibition that's going on. So this might be the kind of social media, emails, write-ups, previews, reviews, some big curator or whatever posting it on their Instagram or Twitter feed, something like that. So at this level, attention is then paid to it. But of course, this discourse itself then becomes a general blur of discourse. Who pays attention to it? What do you pay attention to? So this is the kind of point at which something gets to more of a point where it becomes kind of historicized. It becomes a kind of history. It becomes archived. So it gets into the museum collection where dedicated people will actually look after it. They'll actually take care of it. That's what the meaning of curator is, to take care of something, to pay it attention so other people can pay it attention. So this is a system. Now, I could continue this and the museums would crumble, nobody would care about this. it would be a kind of strange, eccentric kind of culture of the past or whatever. Eventually we'll die. All the human race will die. The sun will explode. The earth will, whatever. You could expand this along John Latham's kind of timeline over kind of millions of years, billions of years, or whatever. And it wouldn't matter in the end. All these kind of little islands, these little enclaves of negative entropy, of order, of attention, would in the end all dissipate into nothing. So that's the ultimate kind of future. But if you imagine outside these boxes, there isn't really time, because if we don't have these kind of points of attention, we don't really have these traces that allow us to kind of map a timeline in the first place. So this is the kind of level of, I guess, a kind of firstness. Peirce would call it a firstness, I guess, where things are not really connected, because any arrangement is as good as any other. They're all kind of random. So this is the object of attention diagram. 5 levels are separating out en route to the pantheon stroke archive, when you establish some kind of cultural order, which of course does change over time due to this kind of messianic kind of eruptions where you kind of go back and things get reordered and so on. So I'm going to end with this. So this is another kind of triangle. This is Carl Andre, and again it's a kind of audio arts thing, which was my first encounter with John Latham, as John explains last week. It's one of his audio art tapes, and he's got this little diagram. I recently found out about this. Somebody told me, I didn't know about it. Carl Andre has 3 vectors. He has the subjective characteristics of the art worker. Have you got the right character to be an artist or whatever? The objective characteristics of the materials, how they actually form and look and come together. And then the availability of economic resources, obviously very important, and often gets left out in the kind of myths of the art, the artist and so on. Absolutely kind of essential. But I think he misses out this 4th factor, which is actually this, I would call it the attention vector. How do you actually get any attention that would kind of sustain a practice in the first place? How do you get access to one of these little demons, these little Maxwell's demons, who are actually going to, separate things out in such a way that, you might have some kind of career, or at least some kind of indication that what you're doing is art beyond your own brain or something. So this is a kind of question of how how things get separated out, how art gets separated out. It's a bigger question, obviously, but just in terms of the art, how things get archived and paid attention to ultimately. So I'll stop sharing.
That's great, Dean. I would like to return to a couple of those diagrams, but I wonder if, because I've spoken a lot already, whether John or Mary wanted to say something.
I had a kind of thought about the hanging book sculpture, kind of massive books, and generally speaking about order and disorder, creation and destruction. And it put me in mind of a book which I haven't read for a long time, by Marshall Berman, All That Is Solid Melts into Air, where he talks about how the condition of modernism is that you can't create anything without destroying the past. And so in Latham, making dysfunctional books, taking away the function books usually have of distributing knowledge and removing that function from them, and then creating a new order out of it. So it's not so much entropy, perhaps. It's entropy in terms of the function they used to serve, but he's now creating a new order out of them, like you were saying before, and making it an intuitive point of contact for people to gain a new knowledge, a new understanding of the universe.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because obviously that's a line from the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels, all that solid melts into air, and it's this kind of it could be seen as a kind of paradox of Marx, which is why a lot of kind of, there's a certain kind of socialist strain. It doesn't really like Marx, because Marx is, he believes in progress, and actually he thought that capitalism, for all the kind of hideous kind of exploitation of human bodies, of people, of people's time, it created conditions in which something like communism would be possible, and you simply couldn't do it without capitalism. I mean, and actually Latham talks about the motivations in a post-capitalist society. I mean, I haven't looked at that any further, but he does talk about how do we establish motivations in a kind of post-capitalist society. But of course, capitalism, a bit like a bit like a drug or something, it has an incredible kind of motivating factor, both in terms of the people who profit from it, and in terms of measured a kind of this kind of money coming in that you can count, you can see it, and there's all these things you can now spend, and of course you can grow and grow and make more and more and establish your empire and so on. So that is very interesting. I mean, I would say ultimately that Marx has this idea that, well, yes, productivity increases. Productivity does increase. It increased under a kind of Stalinist system as much as under a capitalist system, and they both had kind of motivating forces, in the sense that, well, you have to kind of keep working, otherwise, it's not going to be good. But surplus value still applies. It doesn't matter how much kind of productivity there is. There's still there still has to be labour. Without labour, there's no value, basically, which is a kind of interesting point, that for Marx, when wealth increases, value decreases, and there's a little gap where the capitalist can use that to undercut his rivals, because he has a new machinery where he can sell this stuff much cheaper. The value of everyone's labour who's doing the same, making the same kind of products, goes down at that point. People lose their jobs and so on, and the first one to come in then monopolises the system, so you have kind of problems with that. But so there's something which seems like a contradiction, but I guess Marx would call it a dialectic. So we're back with dialectics. I don't know what John would think of that, but
no, that's okay. My sense of it, just briefly, and again, this is just perhaps just throwing it out there, but my sense is that all that's solid is transformed into data, and that's the Baudrillard-Philip K. Dick realization, and then everything is funneled through screens into the datasphere, and that's how you transform old-fashioned labour into attention labour. And that's a kind of, again, that's just a way of seeing things from a kind of society of the spectacle development of Marxism alongside a cybernetic one, and that seems to me what's happening.
I mean, it was also
labour.
The labour.
Interesting phrase.
Yeah, it's that idea that we're all kind of working when we think we're working because we're producing value for someone, even though we think so we've been sold the kind. But I think because I think what Marx is also getting at there, isn't he, is that capitalism has got a kind of progressive side to it, which is the fact that it kind of undercuts religion. For example, established kind of authorities, because religion just isn't kind of efficient. But in Capital, Marx it's very, very clear in the stuff on the fetish that capitalism is completely a religion, just like any other religion. It's the idea that money is real somehow and is kind of autonomously produced and so on. Is just as much a religion. But it's
My sense of all that is solid melts into air is that it's a bit of a myth. I used to really believe it, and I love the poetry of it. It's what I was taught at art school, but
by your Marxist professors.
Yes, it's true. but who don't exist anymore, apart from a very few lovely individuals like me. But it got really challenged totally when I did this anthropology consultancy thing with Martin Holbrad at UCL. They were researching revolutions around the world, and I think it's a problem that Martin was kind of thinking about, because he's interested in Cuba, or not interested in thinking about, but understands that Castro comes to power, but he uses religious imagery and even African imagery. There's a famous, I think it was broadcast on television, or if not in films, where a dove appears on Castro, like a white dove, which has got lots of religious significance. And I think there's obviously an event of some kind in a revolution, but I don't think everything melts into air. I think that there's a residual, like Raymond Williams would say, there's a residual aspect to cultures and economies. So Stalin might want to stamp out religion. You've got to do that.
Well, he established a religion, didn't he? A cult
Yes.
of the individual.
But one of the things he did was obviously turn to Russian nationalism, which Putin has done as well. So there's a sort of it's true. There's something changes in that event, but I think that the kind of modernist myth and also the myth about capitalism destroying religion, because we've got kind of communist capitalism, we've got Islamic capitalism, we've got kind of fundamentalist Christians promoting capitalism. So I'm not so sure. I think capitalism is a remarkable economy because it just doesn't care who it gets into bed with.
I think Marx got it totally wrong there. I mean, there's a strand in Marx and Engels which is, it's very, it's kind of, it's almost a kind of Richard Dawkins kind of thing. I mean, they're like, this is what progress means. We believe in progress, and this is what progress means. One of the things it means is that we don't believe in these silly old stories about gods and stuff anymore. And obviously he was, he was someone who completely rejected his own kind of background as Jewish, and I don't think he came from had a particularly religious upbringing, but it simply, wasn't a kind of thing, even on some kind of cultural level. I prefer the Benjaminian way. I prefer the kind of Benjaminian rather than the Stalinist kind of.
The angel of history.
Which very much taps into kind of Judaism, like deep roots of Judaism, and.
Dean, I saw that you used the messianic time in your timeline, and I was wondering, that's obviously. I mean, I'm guessing that's an explicit reference to a very, very particular formulation of Walter Benjamin's. But you located the messianic at the stage when the artist enters late career and the work starts going into museums. Is that correct?
No. It's like it's like. That's when they should have entered the late career, but they haven't. So you have to the angel has to kind of rescue them. It's like the famous line is from the thesis on the philosophy of history, which in a way is a total negation of the Berman book, I think, or that kind of, at least that the title is that we fight to liberate our grandparents, not our grandchildren. Right? I haven't got that. Like he said it much better, but we fight to liberate our grandparents, which is a kind of anti-entropic process. I mean, I remember when I did that talk with you, John, and I thought maybe one way to describe the difference between science fiction and horror is that science fiction is a kind of fiction that violates the first law of thermodynamics and gives you a kind of perpetual motion or something, and horror is a kind of fiction that violates the second law of thermodynamics by bringing dead things back to life, right? And Benjamin's very much about bringing the dead. I mean, he talks about it like that as well. You bring the dead back to life. As soon as you start talking about your grandchildren, there's an incredible book, I don't know if you've read this book, by Platonov, who was a writer under Stalin, called The Foundation Pit.
Yeah,
and it's a brutal story about they're just digging this pit, and Robert Smithson would have loved it. They just dig this pit, but they keep getting orders that the pit has to get bigger and bigger. So the whole book is they're just digging bigger and bigger pits. I don't know why, but they keep hearing this thing about it's for the grandchildren, it's for these young pioneers, and they become slaves to these grandchildren. This idea of the grandchildren, and you could say that in the 60s, people did benefit very much so in the 60s and 70s from the slave labour of the people during the Stalinist years. They did build it up from nothing, but this is a kind of brutal system. So you bring the dead back to life rather than thinking about the future. It's very, it is very kind of inspired by those kind of religious myths and so on.
Dean, just because I know we've been going a long time, but I found two of your diagrams really interesting. And
only two?
All of them are obviously brilliant, but two of them really got my attention. So
it's all I ask for. If
it's all right with everyone, I'd quite like to go back to firstly to put some pressure on the idea of entropy being relative, but also I was really intrigued by the career path diagram. Could we go to the explanation of entropy, the 2-box one?
This one?
Yeah.
Or this one?
The other one, that one.
Yeah.
What I think I was trying to say, or what I was interested in my talk when I was referencing Roger Penrose, is that and maybe at first I thought maybe this backs up your idea of what is entropy. Well, it's what you count as order or disorder. But his idea to explain the universe as a kind of loop, or not actually as a loop, but as something that is a series of eons, is that disorder and order occur in a black hole.
Yeah.
So, in one sense, on the right, you could think of the attention order as black hole, because the black hole collapses matter together. But that is total chaos and disorder, because everything's collapsed. The laws of physics collapse.
Yeah.
I don't know whether that's a trick, whether that really is entropy. I don't know enough, but I kind of understand the idea that matter has clumped. Matter sort of strings out, and there's no prediction of what that matter is, or there's no space and time at the very center of the black hole. But then as the black hole cools, radiation leaks from the black hole into the surrounding universe. That's the heat entropy. So the black hole has two different kinds of entropy. And that allows Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology to work. So you could say, all right, he's counting two different kinds of entropy there, and it depends what he counts as entropy in each instance. But I think Penrose, like Smolin says, Penrose said to him, quantum physics is wrong. This idea of like observer participant and uncertainty and never being able to say what reality is wrong. And Smolin says yes, it's wrong. And Smolin says that he and Penrose are realists. They believe that there is a real world out there. It's not just about what you pay attention to.
Yeah.
And I think that's not to try and dismantle your diagram, which I think is very good. But I think there is something else, which maybe, I don't mean it in a Lacanian way, but there's something, there's the real, which we can't kind of necessarily grasp or deal with. There's death, for instance. There's the explosion of the sun that you've spoken about, and there are all these kind of events that mean that it's not just about us. We're not at the center of it. It's not about what we look at. It kind of decenters the human in a way, and I do wonder if Latham is trying to acknowledge, like, get at that and understand the limited levels of entropy that we might be able to work with, or time that we might be able to work with, whilst also acknowledging this. Maybe I would say Latham is a realist there.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, I don't know. Obviously, I don't know, and I don't know the mathematics. I mean, it's like it's kind of, it's beyond me. I feel like my intuition is more on Penrose's side, definitely. But I think Rovelli's theory and this coarse graining theory, it kind of works for art. It works for art. I don't think it works for the universe. Well, I can't say it doesn't work for the universe. I prefer the realist model. Just in my gut, I prefer the realist model. I can't believe everything is relative, and I'm quite attracted to entropy as an arrow of time. But I think what he describes actually works for these situations where you have specific actors whose function it is to pay attention and to put things in a certain order. They only really become order because they're paid attention to, and that's, I guess, I'm kind of using the Rovelli in my limited way to draw a kind of analogy to how this actually might function in the more general sense of what we mean by order and disorder, a kind of arrow of time in terms of careers and progression. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Like the kind of expressions we use, that we feel like we're in a state of disorder or a state of chaos if we don't see things kind of joining up, if we don't see one thing leading to another, we feel that we're kind of, everything's kind of falling apart a bit, or nothing is kind of coming together in some kind of constructed whole. But this construction, I would say, always depends on other people. So it's very relational in that sense. Art is very relational in that, not in a Bureau sense, but in the sense of what gets paid attention to. So for me, it's quite a nice, I was attracted to it as a way of maybe describing a certain kind of process that takes place within art in relation to the archive and so on.
I guess I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I guess I was just suggesting in a very unscientific way that the kind of more Bataille, the kind of we are all a meal for the universe kind of,
I think ultimately we
idea.
are, yeah. I'm thinking
that's in Latham a little bit, but there's also, as John has pointed out, this desire to escape that as well, I think. But can you move to the next diagram that I was interested in, which is the career path one, from life to museum?
Yeah.
So I find that really helpful. I think that discourse, I understand, I would say that would be like reception or something. But
yeah.
So what it's so simple and obvious, but also not unsaid. In most art schools, until very recently, I would say, until the last 10 years, that would be the ideal path. That is what.
Yeah.
And it's only recently where we're teaching people who think, well, that's not going to be me. I know that.
Yeah.
what job am I going to have? How am I getting, But why I find this diagram so helpful is I actually think the museum collection is actually in the studio, of course. If we because it's not like the studio attention like in the studio you don't think about the museum attention, or at least for some people, not everybody, but a lot of people do, I think.
Yeah.
But if you replace museum collection with something else, that allows you to kind of think about the different kind of social value or social attention.
Yeah.
And I really like that, because with the group that I work with, although obviously we might have some unconscious or never told desire to be in the museum, but what we get really excited about is when we're asked to be invited to do something in a space, and we can do something, and we can make a performance with other people, like we can invite people, and that's a really rare thing for us, and that becomes I don't think museum collection is a reality for us anyway, as a group.
Well, yeah, no,
But-
I kind of equivocated over that actually, because it's not. Because I was thinking of the archive, but I think the thing
it's not a criticism, Dean. It's not a criticism
No,
of you or your diagram.
I
It's
mean,
just, it's really helpful.
I agree. It's some kind of mechanism which, let's say, separates out at the level of history. It enters history at this point, let's say art history, which might not last long, because all the stuff the National Galleries bought, 50 years ago, they're not showing most of it because it's irrelevant, or 100 years ago it's all what we now call academic painting, or whatever, 120 years ago, whatever. So these things, just because it's in a museum, just because it's in an archive, doesn't mean it will remain there. But there is that level of separating and attention making relates to a kind of process where it kind of enters, it enters a kind of stream of time that will kind of outlive the person, and that knowledge, whether it's embodied in an object or embodied in, I don't know, writing or whatever it is, somehow is looked after. It might be in books,
but it's also an algorithm
in libraries.
It's also an algorithm that
It might just be online, but
right up until your last day on the planet, like aged 99, you might still be thinking studio, artwork, exhibition, reception, museum. I think the interesting thing about it is it describes some kind of ideal of time as well, which, as you're saying, it doesn't really exist because you won't escape the sun exploding.
Yeah.
But I think it's
but that might not be important to you, because what's important to you is maybe the people.
But we don't really have a very good in our education.
In your community.
Really, but in our education, there's not a very good model that's widely used that's different from that one, I would say. Which is the problem.
Well, yeah.
I know they do exist, and that would be an insult to many people, many teachers.
No, of course this model doesn't work in terms of the vast number of people who.
I think. Could I just say something about it, Dean? Because I think it's amazingly useful diagram, and I would like at some point, if possible, to sort of run this alongside the intergenerational matrix diagram that I showed. Yeah. And this really, what you're talking about is exactly what I'm experiencing, teaching at the University of Worcester, fine art, to regional university with young people who just finished their A-levels. And just to give you a quick example, this may be the traditional way in which art has been taught in art schools for quite a while, and I agree there's a general diagram here. And the issue, when you said that David said the museum collection is in the studio, it is, but it's in the studio in a very different way than it used to be. So, for instance, I've got one student who's doing Cy Twombly paintings, which are very, clearly influenced by Twombly, and they're great. And I'm encouraging the person to do them, and why not? Then he's enjoying making them. But he hasn't got a book of Cy Twombly, and there are no art books of Cy Twombly. The only place he's seen Cy Twombly is on the mobile phone or on the computer. So this is what's happening with all the students don't have any access to art books. I mean, they have some. I'm exaggerating, but not like, and again, I'm not being nostalgic about this, but it's very true. In art studios in the 80s, people got books out of the library, big books on Jackson Pollock or, whoever they were interested in, and looked at big pictures of them and flicked through, and they got covered in paint. And they, if they were lucky, they went to museums like the Tate or to London or wherever and they looked at big artworks and they saw stuff. Well, that increasingly isn't happening. And so people are only accessing art digitally through websites, through phones. So the difficulty becomes then that you want to tell the story like Latham, that diagram, Latham's convergence diagram with the, from, Manet to Klein. And you want to tell that story, but you can't tell that story with the work. You can only tell that story as a digital diagram or, referencing. So there is really, I've not got much more to say about that, except that the virtual museum now exists in the studio, not the concrete museum. And that's what's really happening. And then you go into something else. And it's very, very difficult to tell the story of art like Latham could tell it in 1960 or whenever than it is to tell the story now without it becoming seemingly like a kind of ideological, discursive, value-laden, mythic structure, which of course it is. But it feels much more like that now.
Yeah, I think also with social media, people curate their own art. They exhibit their own art on Instagram or whatever.
They create their own discourse.
They create their own space. They separate it out in a way that people can pay attention to it. But whether anyone does pay attention to it is another matter, because there's obviously so much stuff. So it just looks like a random load of disorder, right? Like what seems negentropic to you is highly entropic. It's just a big pile of stuff, just millions and millions of images, right, that people are posting, searching for some kind of affirmation or recognition. And so whether you call it a museum collection is not the point. The point is, when do you get to a point where somebody else is going to do the separating and make sure that attention is paid to this thing? So when do you stop being the curator, which is, very much the kind of cultural situation that we're in now, curating our lives online and so on. When does it happen that someone else does that job because the kind of order that's been recognised as significant, and I'm not being cynical here. I mean, I'm not being cynical about gatekeepers, gatekeepers serve an important function in many ways, even though there may be many problems of the kind that Pierre Bourdieu talked about, so many years ago. But they perform a function in terms of a kind of body of knowledge that would decide that this is significant. But so that is still a process which is beyond curating yourself, I suppose.
But I think in social media and the digital in the studio, I have a very different experience to you, I know, John, but one of the different experiences is I work in the media area of an art school. So for me, it doesn't make sense to just say, right, everyone close your laptops and put your phones away. I remember when Hannah Black's blog posts came out and how much of an effect they had on students that were interested in writing and that had rejected the museum route, just didn't think it was not only not possible for them, but just like, that's just kind of old Eurocentric models got to go. And they're looking for a more kind of social role for art. So I think, first of all, I would hope that personally the museum collection of the great individual artist model would subside, because I'm not interested in that, and that's why I enjoy collaboration. I mean, I take your point about people not going to libraries. I think that's something that you could have a discussion about, because people access information very differently to how they access things online. But again, I can't think it's all
No, well, I guess
and
it's
just
not a negative.
just to say the whole thing about the way that students have been at where I've taught are the kind of vanguard of decolonising the curriculum, pointing out, not only is it mostly white artists, but you don't really know that much about what's going on in China, even though you're teaching Chinese students or whatever. That's not in our library, because what the library is a reinforcement of a monoculture. So while there are problems, I think, with and I understand what you're saying, like there's a whole generation that, as you say, don't know the difference between the DPI of images or what those images formats are. I think also it would be very problematic if all they did was go to the library like I did.
Yeah, but I guess the problem I'm trying to point out, David, and I think we've had this is a longer conversation, perhaps we should save this for another place, which is to do with the discourse of decolonisation, of course, which is really important, but it's very entrenched in certain institutions, in certain cities, certain levels of the game and the hierarchy, and it's very firmly now entrenched in the museum collections and the discourses of the museums, as we well know. So it's not, I guess the problem that I'm having is just pragmatic, is that in order to run a fine art course as a fine art course, and to actually be able to tell students what the thing is that they're doing and the history of what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing and why we do it this way, not that way. And you have to refer back to the canonized pantheon that is the figures that are in the museum. If you don't do that, and I'm not saying, I'm like you, David, I don't particularly like all that, and I've been critical of that all my life, and I've been one of those people that said, we must, deconstruct, challenge, question the disciplinary structures and power involved in all this, and I've spent my life doing that, and I get that. But without that hierarchical structure, that history, that pantheon, as Dean referred to it as, it's very difficult to know what fine art could be for students who are paying £9,000 a year for a degree in it. And that's where I find the difficulty, that I need to refer back to that canonized history in order to say what those why was Pollock important? Why is Carolee Schneemann important? And they did exist within that gallery museum canon and still do. So those artists are, you sort of need that history to tell the story of why you're teaching what you're teaching and why they might be doing what they're doing.
I do understand that. I kind of wonder also if a certain kind of entropy is not being visited upon kind of avant-garde and modernist cultures and traditions, and the kind of heat, if you like, is passing from the library, because I see libraries where I teach are very full, but otherwise they're not. I take your point that the heat of bodies.
Well, they're places of order, aren't they? I mean, it's interesting,
but it's also what we do with, what's our response. And I really appreciate what you're saying, John. I do understand what you're saying. Sorry, Dean. No.
I mean, they're places of they're places of order, aren't they? They're places where we, certain things have been decided that these are what we pay attention to rather than others, but that might have to change.
But
I don't know. I don't know if you're suggesting we should get rid of museums and have a different.
Definitely. But
okay.
I won't go into that. But the interesting thing is, when I used to work at Central Books, one of my jobs was to load a kind of wheelbarrow thing, go up a plank and skip them.
Yeah.
Now that was really, for someone who'd really valued books and been gone to a library when I was young, and my family didn't read things beyond Agatha Christie and Wilbur Smith, and I really identified with books. I just found that really kind of strange, but it kind of taught me, the book warehouse taught me about surplus, not surplus value, there's no kind of permanence, really. I think that's what Latham kind of teaches us. So a kind of challenge might be not to kind of try and kind of exactly hold on to something, although I totally understand what you are saying, John, and I value that culture.
I'll tell you a quick
But
one.
what we do with that kind of entropy, I don't know if it is to completely kind of blame the technology.
When I worked in a bookshop. It's probably the worst bookshop in the world in Hounslow, where I'm from. And the manager, I don't think the manager read any books, but he at one point I used to unpack the books and get it. You know, it was the best job, just be in the room unpacking them all. And at one point he kind of came in. He said, "Come here, quick! You see this big pile of books?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Can you carry them? Carry them over here for me." And he led me down this corridor, and there was a leak dripping from the ceiling. He said, "Put them under the leak." Yeah. He's like, "These are the books we can't sell." Yeah, and I can claim on the insurance, right? So this was, for me, it was really good. I kind of understood this actually when I read Marx and this kind of idea of coagulated labour. You know, you're simply this kind of general body who's there to kind of do whatever you do at that time, and the value of the book has nothing to do with the extrinsic kind of quality in terms of what a book is. So yeah, kind of shocking, but not just a good illustration of capitalism in a kind of way, I think.
But what were the books, Dean? Do you remember what the books were?
No, they're probably a pile of crap anyway, to be honest. I didn't have many books there, but I did buy Art in Theory there, which was like, and I bought it, and the manager said, "I'm glad you bought that, because no one else was ever going to buy that."
But doesn't Latham suggest, books will burn, books will crumble?
Yeah.
And he actually is interested in a knowledge which is beyond the word. So I don't know. I might take it as a great sigil of the archive as a great sigil of a world beyond books.
Mary, you were going to say?
When a flat time house going to destroy the archive? That's what they need to do. Sorry, Mary.
I find those book sculptures a bit difficult to look at sometimes. You know, the associations it brings to me of, burning books and destroying books and censoring knowledge and censoring people. I know that's not what he's saying. He's saying we should challenge the canons of knowledge and think about new ways of putting knowledge together. But there's another association of that.
That might be a good place to end it.